Armenia, a nation located in the southern Caucasus. Whilst geographically in Asia, it is politically and culturally entirely European. Whilst this country does have the favor of being internationally recognized, it does not mean that the country is at all safe, and this is due to their next door neighbor, Azerbaijan. Ever since these two countries' independence in 1991, they have fought several major confrontations against each other, and in the present day, Armenia's military has paled in comparison with Azerbaijan's. All this started in the 1920s over the region of Karabakh. Up till 1914, the Caucasus had been a province of the Russian Empire. However, in 1914, Russia entered World War I on the side of the Entente. Whilst Russia was by no means weak, their military paled in comparison to the Germans, and by 1917, the Germans had already pushed through Russian Poland and Lithuania. It also didn't help that Tsar Nicholas II of Russia was deeply unpopular by now, and in 1917, the Bolsheviks had risen up in Russia and overthrew the monarchy, which started the Russian Civil War. During the Civil War, the Bolshevik movement gradually gained prominence in Russia, and after signing a deal with Germany, Russia was forced to lose the Baltics, Poland, Belarus, Finland, Bessarabia, and Ukraine to Germany, whilst also giving up the southern Caucasus to the Ottoman Empire, as well as paying 6 billion marks to the Germans for damages during the war. Anyways, the southern Caucasus was to be given to the Ottoman Empire, who had been helping Germany in the war. However, the native Caucasian peoples didn't appreciate having their chance for independence wiped out, thus they joined forces to resist the Ottoman invasion. The Ottoman Empire sent roughly 90,000 troops to suppress the Caucasian independence movement. However, that would be a short-sighted decision, as that left them with less soldiers to defend against the invading British armies, and eventually they were forced to give up the Caucasus. Great for the Caucasus. The Ottomans had been defeated, but now who are they going to fight? Oh yes, themselves. Almost immediately, conflict arose in Georgia, as Ossetians and Abkhazians attempted to gain their independence from Georgia. And then we have the most infamous example, Azerbaijan and Armenia. You see, the issue with the Caucasus, it's half the time their country's population won't even be centered in one zone, and might have several exclaves. And this was exactly the problem with Azerbaijan and Armenia, as the two were unable to properly set a mutually agreed upon border. This led to a war breaking out between them and Georgia too, as the three attempted to gain prominence over each other. Despite many Azerbaijani attempts to take Karabakh, the Armenians managed to retain control of the territory. However, this did not last long, as in 1921, the Soviet Union and Turkish nationalists invaded the three countries and split them between themselves. Now under the Soviet Union, the borders were redrawn. Despite being Soviet territory, the three countries retained some forms of local autonomy from the Soviet government, as the Georgian, Armenian, and Azerbaijani Socialist Republics, or SSRs. Some of the Georgian SSR's land was ceded to Azerbaijan and Armenia, which is ironic considering the person drawing these borders was a Georgian. Azerbaijan was also given Nakhchivan from Armenia. However, the status of Karabakh, the region that both sides claimed as theirs, wasn't actually clear. When the Soviet parliament was presented with this issue, they divided the region in two. Most of Karabakh was to be given to Azerbaijan. However, they also carved up a large enclave within Karabakh, which had a 94% ethnic Armenian population, which was called Nagorno-Karabakh, or Highlands Karabakh if you're speaking Russian, and gave that to Armenia. However, when Soviet leader Joseph Stalin saw the idea, he immediately ordered that the region be given back to Azerbaijan, with assurance of autonomy from the Azerbaijani government. The Armenian SSR protested against this, but there was nothing that they could do about it. Throughout Soviet rule, the Azerbaijani SSR encouraged Azerbaijani people to emigrate and settle in Nagorno-Karabakh to try and dilute the ethnic Armenian population there. This tactic was starting to be successful, as by 1923, the population in Nagorno-Karabakh was around 94% Armenian and 6% Azerbaijani. By 1989, the population was 77% Armenian and 23% Azerbaijani. The Armenian SSR sent numerous petitions to the Soviet leaders in Moscow over the years. However, they were often ignored, as the Soviet leaders were often busy with other matters, such as the Cold War. There are also those who believe Stalin intentionally gave Nagorno-Karabakh to Azerbaijan in order to stir up conflict in the scenario that these two countries ever gained independence. By 1989, the Soviet economy had been in decline due to outdated policies and an unwinnable 10-year war in Afghanistan. The Soviet Union began to disintegrate, and seeing its chance, the Armenian SSR yet again sent another petition to Moscow. However, this was yet again ignored. Soon, ethnic violence broke out between the native Armenians and Azerbaijanis living in Nagorno-Karabakh. On August 30, 1991, Azerbaijan officially declared independence from the Soviet Union, and on September 21st of the same year, Armenia followed suit. Azerbaijan was attempting to quell the ethnic Armenian uprising in Nagorno-Karabakh, and this led to the Armenian invasion of Azerbaijan. Armenia was being supported by the newly independent Russian Federation, whilst Azerbaijan sought help from Turkey. The Armenians emerged the war victorious, not only seizing Nagorno-Karabakh, but also the rest of Karabakh from Azerbaijan. The Armenians also deported all the 724,000 Azerbaijanis living in the region to Azerbaijan, essentially turning them into refugees. On May 12, 1994, an armistice was finally signed and the First Nagorno-Karabakh War came to an end. The war caused hundreds of thousands of refugees and around 50,000 deaths in total. Armenia created an internationally unrecognized puppet state in Karabakh known as the Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh, which eventually changed to the Republic of Artsakh. Azerbaijan suffered a devastating defeat during the war, as hundreds of thousands of Azerbaijanis now had been displaced and they had suffered economic losses due to the war. And whilst Armenia didn't get it off easy either, Azerbaijan's loss would still come back on the Armenians later, as Azerbaijan had something that Armenia didn't: the Caspian Sea, a region filled with offshore crude oil and natural gas reserves. Western energy companies soon began flocking to Azerbaijan to fund oil extraction processes, which would be able to bring profits to the government. At the present day, it's estimated Azerbaijan has 7 billion barrels worth of recoverable oil and about 1.3 trillion cubic meters of natural gas, all capable of being harvested. With the profits coming from all this oil and gas, Azerbaijan has been able to rapidly increase its economic potential, and thanks to this, Azerbaijan was able to dump billions of dollars into their military, to the point where by 2020, Azerbaijan's military budget tripled Armenia's. Another factor favoring the Azerbaijanis was their population. Armenia's population has been steadily declining since 1991. At 1991, Armenia's population stood at around 3.6 million people. By 2020, this figure had shrunk to about 2.8 million. In 1991, Azerbaijan's population stood at around 7.3 million. However, by 2020 it had increased to around 10.1 million people. It also didn't help that Azerbaijan had better weapons suppliers. Armenia was ordering the majority of their arms imports from Russia, whose weapons tend to date back to the 1980s or 90s. Azerbaijan imported and still imports the majority of the weapons that it has from Israel and Turkey, which have some of the newest and most sophisticated weapons on Earth. On April 1, 2016, a violent clash broke out for 4 days, as the Azerbaijanis attempted an offensive against the Armenian-backed Artsakh army. However, the Armenians managed to repel the offensive. One heck of a way for Azerbaijan to say April Fools, am I right? Anyway, what's known as the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War broke out on September 27th, as the Azerbaijanis launched a massive offensive to southern Karabakh. On November 10th, Armenia surrendered and a Russian-backed ceasefire was put into place. In this war, Azerbaijan emerged victorious, particularly due to the Turkish-made Bayraktar drones that wreaked havoc on the Armenian army. Deaths in the war are mostly assumed to be around 4,000 for Armenia and 3,000 for Azerbaijan. During the war, Armenia called upon the CSTO, which is the Russian version of NATO, and requested assistance. However, Russian President Vladimir Putin's reply was that so long as the war took place on Azerbaijan's soil, the alliance would not come to Armenia's aid. The ceasefire that ended the war stated that Armenia was to cede the territory of Karabakh, excluding most of Nagorno-Karabakh, back to Azerbaijan, with the exception of the Lachin corridor, which was to remain open from Armenia to Nagorno-Karabakh. Armenia was to open a checkpoint-free corridor between Azerbaijan's mainland and its exclave Nakhchivan, and Russian peacekeepers were to enter the territory to safeguard the area. Armenia was also to remove its army from the area, leaving the defense up to the Artsakh army itself. The war was a crushing defeat for Armenia, as they lost a large part of the territory they occupied in Azerbaijan, and the Armenians living in Nagorno-Karabakh were now under threat. The war's loss also led to large protests in the Armenian capital of Yerevan. However, Azerbaijan wasn't done yet. Between the 12th and the 14th of September 2022, Azerbaijan lost missile strikes into Armenia proper, and even occupied a small slice of territory. Armenia yet again called on the CSTO to help. However, this was yet again rejected, as the geopolitical atmosphere had significantly changed since 2020. The first big issue was that the government in power at the time had been falling out of favor with the Russian president, due to the Armenian prime minister being more interested in befriending the West. The second biggest event was the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine. Russia had suffered around 300,000 casualties in said invasion, of which 100,000 had died. Russia had also lost about 3,000 tanks. Thus, even if technically the CSTO had to act, Russia couldn't possibly afford to send aid to Armenia. This only led to Armenia continuing to shift westwards in alignment. The final nail in the Armenian coffin came on 19 September 2023, when Azerbaijani forces launched another offensive on the Republic of Artsakh, with a massive bombing raid on the capital Stepanakert, which killed over 200 Armenians. After just a day, the Republic of Artsakh's army had to surrender, and soon a peace deal had been negotiated between the Azerbaijani government and the Artsakh government, in which the government of Artsakh agreed to dissolve itself by January 1st, 2024, and also disband the army. Ever since then, 100,000 out of the 120,000 of the Armenians living in the territory, out of fear of ethnic cleansing, opted to flee Artsakh to Armenia proper. This yet again launched massive riots in Yerevan. Armenia now lost the entirety of its territory in Azerbaijan, and remains only with its internationally recognized borders to shelter its people. However, just because the trouble in Karabakh is finally done with, doesn't mean that Azerbaijan is finished with Armenia yet. See, despite the fact that the 2020 ceasefire stated that Armenia was supposed to open a checkpoint-free corridor for Azerbaijani troops to be able to freely cross to Nakhchivan, this was never opened, and recent theories suggest that the Azerbaijani government plans to invade Armenia proper, to seize the Syunik province for themselves in order to finally establish a link between them and Nakhchivan. And with that, they'd also unlock the potential to build railways from Azerbaijan itself to Turkey and the rest of the Western world. Naturally, one particular country was opposed to this approach: Iran. See, Iran and Azerbaijan have a rather strained relationship for several reasons, the largest of which involves the fact that Azerbaijan gave Israel access to some of its airfields close to the Irani border, which Israel could hypothetically use one day to bomb Iran itself. The other reason is due to the large ethnic Azerbaijani ethnicity located on its northern border. This region here, known as South Azerbaijan, has over 17 million Azerbaijanis living there, more Azerbaijanis than in Azerbaijan itself. Iran fears that Azerbaijan might one day try to seize the region of South Azerbaijan for itself, which, to their credit, isn't the first time the Azerbaijanis threatened Iran by doing military drills on the border. A more logical scenario, the Azerbaijanis living there might try to secede from Iran and join Azerbaijan. Thus, naturally, the last thing Iran wants is to see Azerbaijan strengthened, and resultantly, Iran has threatened war if Azerbaijan dared to ever invade the Syunik province. However, it's not exactly clear if Iran will actually do anything about this, as their attention is fully focused on the crisis with Israel at the moment of this video's scripting. With Russia clearly being unwilling and unable to help Armenia, and Iran being too focused on the Israel issue to be able to stand in for them, Armenia had to look for other allies, and one country in particular soon became the ideal candidate: France. France had been looking for a way to poke around in Russia's orbit for quite some time now, and Armenia was now a golden opportunity. In October 2023, French President Emmanuel Macron stated that he fully supported Armenia's independence and promised to sell Armenia military equipment, send a military advisor to Armenia to help its defenses, and even train some of Armenia's soldiers at the French military academies. The most important asset, however, was the GM-200, an air defense radar that has a range of up to 200 kilometers or roughly 124 miles. And this is important, seeing how well Azerbaijan managed to use the Turkish Bayraktar drones against Armenia back in 2020. France provided Armenia with about 3 of these elite air defense systems. Obviously, this angered the Azerbaijanis, and the Azerbaijani president Ilham Aliyev accused France of destabilizing the region. Despite the arms sales, France hasn't given Armenia a proper defense pact yet, and thus there's still potential for Azerbaijan to invade Syunik. All they're waiting for is the right time, with that right time presumably being a hypothetical Iranian attack on Israel or vice versa. Assuming Azerbaijan successfully incorporates Syunik, the consequences would leave Armenia crippled as it would lose a massive swath of its land and would weaken it worse than ever before. As for Azerbaijan, the consequences could include international sanctions or, worst case scenario, an invasion from Iran. In the future, France might finally sign a proper defense agreement with Armenia that might finally secure Armenia's independence. We just have to wait and hope Armenia's dream is finally realized.